Previously on The Man of Steel, we covered writer-artist John Byrne's miniseries that retold and updated the origin of Superman in the wake of the Crisis on Infinite Earths event that relaunched the DC Universe.
The miniseries would see multiple tweaks to Superman's backstory, including ditching his heroic antics as Superboy. He did have powers as a youth, but he never paraded around as Superboy. He was also the last true Kryptonian. There was no Supergirl or Superdog getting in the way. And arch-nemesis Lex Luthor went from mad scientist to business tycoon because it was the 1980s. We also saw Superman's first hectic meeting with Batman, a tearful reunion with his high school sweetheart Lana Lang, as well as Lex Luthor's attempt at cloning, which resulted in "I love you, Bizarro, I love you."
Part of what was to happen is that the Superman series would all receive new #1 issues, with there being Action Comics Superman and Adventures of Superman. John Byrne would work on Action Comics and Superman, while the creative team of Marv Wolfman and Jerry Ordway would take over Adventures of Superman. However, DC would have a change of heart, and basically Action Comics would actually keep its original numbering. The Superman ongoing series would be relaunched with a new #1, and Adventures of Superman would pick up the numbering of the previous ongoing Superman series. Yeah, I know, that's a lot to cover, but that's what we're talking about today as these new creative directions head into the ongoing Superman storylines with Man of Steel Volume 2.
Superman had recently discovered that the rocket that had brought him from Krypton planet Earth was stolen, and he managed to track it to a facility outside of Metropolis. Inside, he finds several photos and computer readouts detailing his physiology. He then finds the body of a dead scientist whose neck was snapped by pure force. A bioscan from his microscopic vision reveals to Superman that this was indeed the individual who stole the rocket from the Kent farm. However, the Man of Steel can't really get the authorities involved yet unless they discover his human identity. So he literally lifts the entire facility into outer space for further study and leaves for a jogging date with Lois Lane. The running is interrupted by the two reporters spotting that the first bank of Metropolis has been robbed, with the doors being literally ripped off of the hinges. They begin investigating, only for an individual to come out, grab Lois, and take a half-hearted punch from Clark Kent, which is done so that the mild-mannered reporter can be sent flying behind the desk and so he can transform to Superman. While Superman prepares to enter the fray for realsies, the robber introduces himself as Metallo, which is a name given to him by the scientist who created him. Superman attempts to take Metallo down, only to suddenly be tossed aside like a rag doll. Something has gone wrong, and the Man of Steel is suddenly losing strength.
So yes, the dead scientist from earlier, known only as Vale, basically created Metallo by taking the organs and brain of an individual named John Corbin, who was a career criminal, and transferring it into a metallic skeleton that was powered by an irradiated piece of the planet Krypton harvested from Superman's rocket. The fact of the matter is, Vale is extremely xenophobic, for reasons we'll expand on a little bit later, and now seeks to eliminate all alien presence on Earth.
Of course, Metallo immediately killed Professor Vale, as he really didn't need the scientist anymore, and reveals that the name of his power source is kryptonite. Superman and Metallo resume fighting, with the racket attracting the attention of Lex Luthor. Metallo's full form is exposed as he opens up his chest and begins bathing the Man of Steel in kryptonite radiation. And then the Metallic Man suddenly vanishes, with Lois explaining that there was just a large flash and, well, now he's gone. She begins questioning what it means for Superman to be an alien, but he promises to explain things later before going after who's responsible for Metallo's disappearance.
I think it's pretty easy to guess that the individual behind Metallo's disappearance is none other than Terraman. Or, maybe it's just Lex Luthor.
Things then take a very strange turn as Superman suddenly starts attacking various buildings in Metropolis, which attracts the attention of several members of the Teen Titans. Those being Cyborg, Wonder Girl, Beast Boy, and Jericho. In fact, it's Jericho who manages to calm things down as he faces into the Man of Steel and realizes that Kal-El's mind is not his own. In fact, this is confirmed when a handicapped scientist named Gunderson steps forward to proclaim that he is in reality Superman.
In a nutshell, Gunderson contacted Clark Kent about the whereabouts of Superman in order to gain assistance for an experiment. However, in reality, he just wanted to pull the old brain switcheroo. Now the Titans are involved and they're just going to set things back to normal. So that's the end of the story.
The news of these events further rankles Lex Luthor, who's focused much of his company's resources and tried to find a weak link in the Man of Steel. And it appears they may have actually found that link, as a private investigator has used some surveillance pictures to pick out Lana Lang from a group of onlookers during the Man of Steel's first appearance in Metropolis. She also shows up in several other pictures of Superman's antics, and so they start making the connection. Luthor is so pleased that he immediately starts coercing his employee into a sexual relationship.
Ew.
Luthor then turns his investigative attention to Metallo, only to be upset that the lead scientist is more concerned with keeping the humanoid robot alive, so Lex just rips out Metallo's kryptonite heart. Luthor's employees then track Lana Lang to Smallville and even trace the Kents' whereabouts as they begin ransacking both properties. When Lana manages to catch them in the act, she's knocked out and abducted. Luthor then uses a tracking drone to alert Superman to Lana's whereabouts. Superman finds Lana's beaten body in a janitor's closet, and she explains that she was tortured to try to turn over as much information as she had on him. She also points out that they might have the Kents, so they might be doing the same to them as well. Superman immediately crashes into Lex's office, but immediately drops to his knees in Luthor's presence. As it turns out, Lex had part of Metallo's kryptonite fashioned into a ring.
I'm sure that ring is not going to have any negative long-term side effects whatsoever.
Luthor won't kill Superman, and it's too much fun just playing games, but he tells the Man of Steel to vacate before he changes his mind. Reluctantly, Superman returns Lana to Smallville, where they find the Kents unharmed. As for Luthor, well, his computers have finally finished their tests and done enough analysis to conclude that Clark Kent is in fact Superman. It's a notion Luthor immediately dismisses. Clark Kent is too clumsy and mild-mannered to be an ultra-powerful Ubermensch. The idea is so repulsive to him that he immediately fires the private investigator that he was sexually harassing.
Well, at least she now has to stop having sex with Lex Luthor, so I'm just going to say it's a win all around. Anyway, you might be a little bit confused. Like I said, Man of Steel was a miniseries that acted as a retelling of Superman's origin, and then that was going to kind of dovetail into the ongoing Superman titles, and I think that has led into a little bit of plot holes. For example, again, it's like I said, if you don't take into account that Man of Steel is kind of a year one story, you might have been confused if you had read that and saw that Lex Luthor had hair and now he's bald. So yeah, and not only that, but our next story has a storyline involving Lois Lane's mother, Eleanor, who was injured in some type of industrial chemical accident, and again, this wasn't depicted in any of the books before that, so if you're just jumping on, you're going to be a little bit confused.
The Lanes, Lois, her sister Lucy, and father Sam hold a vigil over Eleanor, so she's not at the Daily Planet, which means Perry White must pair his newest reporter, gossip columnist Cat Grant, with Clark Kent to do a report on a former government scientist named Emil Hamilton. Grant is such a replacement for Lois that Clark can't help but begin flirting with her.
Cat Grant has continued to have a presence throughout a lot of Superman media. In fact, you probably know her best for being played by Callista Flockhart in the Arrowverse Supergirl television series.
While that is happening, a terrorist group called the Freedom League has launched several attacks on buildings throughout Metropolis. Clark is able to spot two surviving victims as he and Cat bear witness to the cleanup efforts of one of the attacks. The two then move on to Dr. Hamilton, who explains that he's developed technology that manipulates magnetic waves into an impenetrable force field. Unfortunately, the government cut his funding because they're only interested in blowing things up. The demonstration gets interrupted by the Freedom League assaulting Metropolis City Hall. Clark leaves Cat behind to finish the report so Superman can go thwart the attack. However, the Man of Steel must be extremely careful as it turns out the pilots are bio-linked to their giant machines that they are piloting, which eventually begin combining to form Voltron.
Wait a minute, guys! Something's not right! Let's take it back to step 6!
Things aren't exactly going great for Lois Lane either, as she's suddenly abducted from the hospital by Lex Luthor. Now back to Superman.
Things go from bad to worse for Superman as Dr. Hamilton shows up and begins entering the fray by turning on his machine to ensnare both Superman and the robots in the magnetic field. Hamilton hopes that a public demonstration of his machine helping Superman will get some funding. Part of the problem is that it turns out that Hamilton's company was a subsidiary of LexCorp, and Luthor now is claiming ownership over the technology. Unfortunately, things have taken a rather tragic turn as being trapped in the force field has caused a self-destruct measure to go off inside the robots, and now all the pilots are dead. Hamilton tries to explain things to the press, but only gets ignored as they only want the Man of Steel as he trudges off. Finally, a desperate Hamilton takes matters into his own hand and takes his woman hostage in contacting Superman on a low-level frequency. But Superman simply muscles through all the attacks and knocks Hamilton out. Hamilton is then taken to prison where he continues to be ignored. Meanwhile, Lois is brought back to Lex Luthor, who explains that the chemical plant where Eleanor was injured and poisoned was a LexCorp subsidiary. To that end, his scientists have developed a serum to treat all the victims, and it will be available free of charge, no strings attached. That being said, he's the only one who knows the formula, and it could easily be forgotten if, say, the Daily Planet starts turning up the pressure on him again.
Well, at least she doesn't have to sleep with him. Now, as for Emil Hamilton, well, he eventually does redeem himself and become one of Superman's trusted assistants, often helping in the study of Kryptonian technology. Unless, of course, you follow the DC animated universe, where he eventually betrays Superman and joins Project Cadmus, an organization hell-bent on eliminating superheroes altogether.
The Phantom Stranger witnesses a rapidly aging Superman battling a magical being called Arathaha, who has possessed a woman named Barb Kowalski. He manages to break free from the possession and smashes her power rod in order to free Barb and get her to safety. However, the ensuing explosion tosses a magical rock into a nearby graveyard. When the Man of Steel returns home, the Phantom Stranger explains that the stone has caused the souls of the dead to become uneasy and begin combining into a giant Gestalt monster that will destroy Metropolis until the stone is retrieved. The Man of Steel provides distraction long enough for the Stranger to get the stone and return things to normal. For now.
Now, back in episode 49 of the Random Trade Review, we covered a DC crossover event called Legends. One of the threads in there involved a lot of anti-alien and superhero sentiment being whipped up in the general populace by a TV pundit named G. Gordon Godfrey.
Godfrey was actually Glorious Godfrey, one of the underlings of Darkseid, the despotic ruler of the planet Apocalypse. Glorious Godfrey has psychic manipulation abilities, and he was dispatched to Earth in order to turn the public against superheroes and thus make it ripe for invasion.
Now, if you remember that episode, one of the main problems I had with that collection was that there were issues missing. Seriously, one issue ends with Darkseid planning to launch an attack against Superman, and then the next issue has Superman talking to President Reagan and saying, "Darkseid just attacked me." Now, since then, there actually has been a re-release of that storyline that does contain those tie-in issues, but at the time, the collection I have didn't have that, so that's why I was so negative on it. Anyway, we are now going to be covering the tie-in issues to Legends.
Darkseid's Omega beams pursue Clark Kent through the streets of Metropolis. Knowing that he has to maintain a secret identity, he tries to make his way into the sewer in order to change into Superman. Unfortunately, he winds up running into some utility workers, which allows the beams to catch up and transport Clark to Apocalypse and a very confused Darkseid. Thinking he's made a mistake, Darkseid chucks Clark out a window in order to feed him to the poorest denizens of Apocalypse, known as the Hunger Dogs. This proves to be enough to allow Clark to change into Superman, but he has to lay low in order to avoid the parademon sentries of Darkseid. He begins trying to dress like some of the Hunger Dogs, but he can't resist when he sees a supposed revolutionary woman named Amazing Grace about to be executed. He steps forth, revealing his identity as Superman, and begins engaging a pacifier robot in a fight. It's then that Superman realizes that Apocalypse is under a red sun, so his power is greatly weakened, and he winds up getting tackled into one of the exhaust ports, much to the delight of Darkseid. Superman is not killed, though, as a salvager manages to pull him out, but the flames of Apocalypse have somehow wiped his memory. That being said, Amazing Grace recognizes him and proclaims Superman the savior of Apocalypse. Superman demonstrates some of his abilities on the parademons, which spurs the Hunger Dogs on to revolution. Later, Amazing Grace seduces Superman while he recovers. Soon, the Man of Steel is clothed in new apocalyptic armor and mowing through all who stand in his way, much to the delight of Amazing Grace. Because in reality, Superman is not fighting for the Hunger Dogs, he's fighting against them, as he's now joined Amazing Grace and her true leader, Darkseid.
This man is overgasped!
Amazing Grace is the sister of the Glorious Godfrey and shares his psychic manipulation powers. She's actually behind Superman's amnesia. And yes, this is where that one plotline came from in the final episodes of the Superman animated series.
That being said, Highfather of New Genesis has some suspicions and dispatched Orion and Light Ray to investigate. Superman continues to train under the supervision of Granny Goodness to fully return his strength for the eventual invasion of Earth. First, though, he has to be dispatched to take on Light Ray and Orion. However, Orion, son of Darkseid, is a physical match for the Man of Steel.
Orion is the biological son of Darkseid, who is exchanged with the son of Highfather of New Genesis, scot-free, aka the hero Mr. Miracle, as part of a ceasefire between the two warring planets. Orion has long since sought to destroy his father and try to restore peace between the two worlds as one entire civilization. However, in many prophecies, such as the Alex Ross Mark Waid series Kingdom Come, it's shown that he winds up becoming just as corrupt as his actual father. Now, Light Ray is a member of the New Gods with a litany of powers, including knowledge of the Song of the Universe and the ability to change its structure by knowing the right notes. Which sort of explains if you were ever confused by the finale of the DC Comics crossover event Final Crisis, but that's another story for another time.
Light Ray manages to take out Amazing Grace by nullifying her powers and blinding her in a blast. This allows Orion to restore Superman's memories with a mother box, and before he can get his revenge on Darkseid, Superman is sent back to Earth via the Omega Beams.
And that concludes our look at Volume 2 of Man of Steel. How was it? Well, I do think there's some very nice artwork throughout all of this. It's nice, it's consistent, it's not overly jarring, and there's some really good characterization throughout a lot of this too. Superman still definitely feels like Superman. Lois feels like Lois. Again, I do like Cat Grant as an addition. I think that's really entertaining. And when you look at Lex Luthor as a villain, I like the cold, calculating, manipulative Lex Luthor. Not so much the sex pest Lex Luthor. I mean, I know he's the villain, but does he have to be that much of a villain? Like, you know, a little. I wish he were a little bit more that the businessman and not the human turd. Yeah, if you catch my drift. And overall, on the plus side, again, I'd say the Legends issues are a really fun read, but there's a caveat there, and that again, I really wish they were in Legends back when I reviewed that, and not this. Here, it's just too darn a switch. In fact, overall, I'd say the pacing in a lot of these stories is really wonky. Some stories read way too fast, other stories read way too slow. The stuff with the Phantom Stranger and Professor Hamilton is just really boring. It's not interesting. Hamilton kind of looks like a doofus, constantly trying to impress Superman for some reason, and again, like, it doesn't add much in the way of depth, and I reiterate the plot holes from earlier. Again, boy, you know, I would have liked to have seen Lois's mother getting injured in that industrial accident. I think that would have added some help. Again, I think maybe we shouldn't have had Hamilton talking his story in flashback. I think that should have just been playing out as a subplot throughout some of the issues. And overall, again, I think it's lacking that there's a lot of Lois and Clark interacting with each other. That was a strong point of the miniseries, as you saw them bantering with each other, getting, and you saw the development of their relationship. And again, when you add a character like Cat Grant to the mix, that could have presented a new branch. Like I said, you can tell Clark's also kind of attracted to her too, and openly flirts with her. That could have presented some interesting ideas, and it's just not here. And unfortunately, that really does suffer because of that. And again, I think it just leads to a real uneven feeling throughout all of this. This isn't bad, but I would really only recommend this if you're a Burns Superman completist, and not so much for the general audience. And unfortunately, that's why I really have to penalize this book. I have to give it a D. It's just not the best. Again, like I said, really only read this if you want to get a nice grand vision of John Byrne's Superman. Other than that, you could probably stand to skip it. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.
Hey guys, remember you can support my work at patreon.com/CP Time for Cat Productions, where you can even request a trade to be put in the randomizer, aka the cardboard box. Also, remember to like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring that notification bell so that you can be notified for further videos.